On October 23, 1896, 80-year-old Jacob Freud died in Vienna. His son, Sigmund, was deeply shaken.
I find it difficult to write just now. The old man's death has affected me profoundly. With his peculiar mixture of deep wisdom and fantastic lightheartedness, he had a significant effect on my life. I now feel quite uprooted. My father's death revolutionized my soul. By the time he died, his life had long been over. But in my inner self, the whole past has been reawakened.
Freud's childhood came rushing back, flooding him with disturbing dreams and half-forgotten memories. And out of the tumult, he would fashion a theory that would change forever the way we think and feel about ourselves.
All the key concepts of human psychology have been with us since the ancient world. But nobody before Freud took this kind of wisdom, systematized it, and offered alleviation of human suffering on the basis of it. That was totally new.
Freud believed that the human being is an animal in conflict. We are not masters of our own house. Much of our life is determined by unconscious forces that we don't know about.
It's a frightening notion. It flies in the face of all our wishes to have our free will affirmed, our rationality affirmed.
Unconscious wishes, slips of the tongue, repressed impulses. He gave us a language for our fears and dreams, our deeply held secrets, our darkly imagined nightmares.
We're blasé about it now because Freud's thinking has become part of the very language we use. You're being defensive, you're rationalizing, or you're conflicted about that. His insights into the ways in which our minds are divided, the ways in which we are at war with ourselves, change our very conception of human nature and of the nature of mind.
Freud spent his life, as he once put it, struggling with the demon of irrationality. But everything he believed grew from the discoveries he made as a young man before the turn of the 20th century, when he learned that to grapple with the demons inside others, he would have to wrestle with his own. Vienna, the glittering capital of the Empire of Austria-Hungary. With a booming population and a dazzling array of new public buildings, as the 19th century drew to a close, the ancient city was bursting with pride and confidence. Sigmund Freud grew up in Vienna, the eldest of 7 children. He knew its splendid palaces and modern boulevards, its markets and parks. But he ignored its festive air and effervescent gaiety. While others dreamed of champagne and waltzes, young Freud dreamed of fame. In 1877, Sigmund Freud was an ambitious 21-year-old who planned to devote his life to science. The man who would one day explore the tumultuous world of the mind, desires, dreams, anxieties, wishes, began by studying the anatomy of the brain. As a student at the University of Vienna, he published well-argued scientific papers with cautious conclusions, illustrated by his own painstaking drawings. His professor was one of the most famous scientists of his day, Ernst Wilhelm von Brucker. With his piercing blue eyes and penetrating intellect, Brucker was a formidable figure. The greatest authority, Freud wrote, I ever met. 40 years Freud's senior, Brucker was the first of a series of men whom Freud would revere and emulate before striking out in his own direction.
Brucker was very tough on the medical students who worked with him, very demanding. Freud felt a sense of admiration as well as a good deal of fear, the way you might feel about a very intelligent, very demanding father.
Brucker insisted on careful observation, experimentation, and physical or chemical explanations of biological phenomena. For Brucker, the intangible feelings and thoughts of the mind were hidden within the brain's gelatinous tissue. Even the mind could be reduced to physical laws.
The main thing that the young Freud learns in Brucker's laboratory is that nothing is valid which cannot be put into strict laws of physics and chemistry. That is the whole wish to reduce the human being to the laws of science.
Freud would struggle for years to go beyond what he learned in Brucker's laboratory, to develop a theory of the mind that was not based on the biology of the brain. When Freud was 26, his commitment to laboratory science came to an end. 21-year-old Martha Bernays was peeling an apple when Freud first saw her. Soon, he was sending her red roses every day and calling her Princess. Within 2 months, they were engaged.
My precious, most beloved girl, I knew it was only after you had gone that I would recognize the full extent of my happiness. I still cannot grasp it. And if that sweet little picture were not lying in front of me, I would think it was all a beguiling dream.
Ziggy, my Ziggy, today for the first time I call you by your name. My darling, I am happy. Yes, happy as I have never been in my long life.
But Freud was too poor to marry Martha. A penniless student still living at home, he could hardly support a wife and family.
My sweet girl, it only pains me to think I should be so powerless to prove my love for you. In front of me sizzle the gas bubbles which I have to filter. The whole thing spells resignation, waiting.
With no real prospect of ever earning a livelihood from his scientific work, desperate to marry Martha, Freud made a painful decision. Just 6 months after he met her, he sacrificed his scientific ambitions for the woman he loved. He decided to become a doctor.
Brucker takes him aside and says to him, "Look here, young man, you can't make a living this way." If Brucker had been able to pay his wages, you and I would have never heard of him.
Freud would spend 3 lonely years at Vienna General Hospital, trying his hand at surgery, internal medicine, psychiatry, not knowing which might become his specialty. He rarely saw Martha now. She had moved with her family to Hamburg in northern Germany, far from Vienna. Restless, he read late into the night, Cervantes, Goethe, Shakespeare, and every day wrote Martha long, passionate letters.
My beloved Marty, these difficult times will not discourage me. I know how sweet you are, how you can turn a house into a paradise.
My beloved sweet Ziggy, why can't we be together? I could not sleep half the night. Your dear and noble image was before me, and my longing for you was so intense.
She was his first love, and he was extremely ardent.
Fair mistress, sweet love, do you realize that it is 2 whole days since I heard from you?
It is such a sweet feeling to make something for you.
And that I am beginning to worry.
The night before last, I dreamt continuously of you.
Could you be ill or angry with me?
I only fear that you are too passionately involved in your work.
I have to fight the sensation of being a monk in a cell. When a letter from you arrives, life enters. I am so much in the mood to hear you talk, and to close your mouth every now and again with a kiss to make you stop.
While Freud studied medicine, he continued his own research, hoping for some important discovery. When he began experimenting with a poorly understood drug, he was convinced he would soon win fame, fortune, and make Martha his wife.
We need no more than 1 stroke of luck to consider setting up house. I have been reading about cocaine.
Cocaine was a powerful painkiller, but Freud learned that it also acted on depression.
He complains of depression and of low energy level. Freud did not anticipate cocaine's very, very strong addictive qualities. He finds this magical substance which elevates his mood, which gives him enormous energy, and he feels like he has discovered the elixir of life.
In my last severe depression, I took coca again, and a small dose lifted me to the heights.
Freud published a paper on cocaine and prescribed it for himself, his patients, his friends. He even sent some to Martha. To make her strong, he wrote her, and give her cheeks a red color. When other scientists discovered cocaine's addictive powers, Freud's hopes for success and fortune quickly vanished. Although he would turn to cocaine occasionally over the next years, he never became addicted, and eventually stopped using the drug altogether. In the fall of 1885, impatient with what he could learn in Vienna, Freud traveled to Paris. He had won a scholarship to study with one of the greatest neurologists of his day. At the height of his fame, Jean Charcot was called the Napoleon of neuroses. Charcot, Freud wrote Martha, is a man whose common sense borders on genius.
Charcot was a compelling, charismatic man, and Freud was always attracted to compelling, charismatic men. The turning point for Freud really was his year in Paris and the work with Charcot.
Charcot would introduce the young medical student to a mystery he would spend the rest of his life trying to fathom. The power of mental forces hidden away from conscious awareness. Many of Charcot's patients suffered from a bizarre array of physical and emotional problems. Symptoms of a puzzling affliction doctors called hysteria.
There are medical texts that describe hysteria, from stuttering and facial tics to major motor symptoms. Arching backwards in a bed, total rigidity of the body, swooning away and losing consciousness, inability to swallow, numbness. So they would do a battery of tests and they would come up with the conclusion that there was no organic cause. Somebody would be paralyzed one day and the next day they would get up out of bed and be fine, and then several days later the paralysis returns. That is not an organic paralysis.
The cause of hysteria was unknown. Unable to find a physical explanation, medical doctors were frustrated, often curtly accusing their patients of faking.
The common wisdom was that hysteria was a disease for which there was no cure. They would put them in a psychiatric hospital in a ward, and that was the end of them. It was a death sentence, this diagnosis. And to think in terms of being able to cure hysterics was really radical.
Hysterics used to be the despair of the physician. Freud at one point said, when a patient is a hysteric and the doctor finishes examining him, there is no change in the patient, but there is a marked change in the doctor.
The riddle of hysteria excited Freud's curiosity. If he could reveal its unknown cause, he might gain the recognition he had long hoped would be his. Charcot treated hysteria with hypnosis. Under his hypnotic spell, his patients would follow his suggestions, and a paralysis would disappear, a tic subside, only to reappear later when the trance faded.
Here is this great, French physician with a great reputation indeed, who uses hypnotism. Hypnotism was the kind of thing that you did at fairs, games that you played with the gullible. This was a very unrespectable thing to do.
Freud was struck by Charcot's forceful demonstration of the mind's power, even over the body itself.
It was the recognition that there's a depth to mind and layers of consciousness and unconsciousness at play. And this was an enormous insight for Freud because it was the first inkling that the mind was not transparent.
Freud had arrived in Paris, fascinated by problems of the brain. 5 months later, he returned to Vienna, intrigued by problems of the mind. That spring, in a small office in the heart of the city, he began to practice medicine, specializing in neurology, treating patients with both physical and nervous disorders. At last, he was able to scrape together enough money to make Martha his wife. On September 14, 1886, after 4 years of waiting, 30-year-old Sigmund Freud married the only woman he would ever love.
I'm finding it all most strange, my utter effrontery in getting married and setting myself up as a man who can do anything he likes. But the Bodensee is frozen over, and my happy heart is leaping gaily across it.
Martha quickly became the kind of wife Freud had hoped for. busy with home and family.
Martha produced 6 children in a little over 9 years. She was constantly pregnant.
She was a very good housefrau. She was very thrifty. My father would say that his mother would rather poison the whole household than throw food away.
Freud became a man of regular habits. He had his mustache and beard trimmed daily by his barber, strolled the boulevard each day, and played cards with the same group of friends every Saturday night. 5'7", faultlessly dressed, he loved a good cigar. He smoked more than 20 a day. As Freud began his work as a neurologist, he continued to be puzzled by the riddle of hysteria. Like other doctors of his day, he treated hysteria with discreetly delivered jolts of electricity.
My therapeutic arsenal contained only 2 weapons, hypnotism and electrotherapy. Unluckily, I was soon driven to see that electrotherapy was of no help whatever.
Bewildered, searching for a more effective treatment, Freud turned for advice to a new mentor, a brilliant physician who had also been experimenting with hypnotism. Joseph Breuer was a highly regarded doctor with a thriving practice. Nearly 15 years older, Breuer had befriended Freud when Freud was still a student, lent him money, shared his ideas. The 2 men grew so close that Freud named his oldest daughter after Breuer's wife. Breuer had once shared with Freud the story of one of his patients, a young woman he would later call, to guard her identity, Anna O.
Anna O was very beautiful. She was unusually clever. And as a patient, she was enough to keep anybody busy.
Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, a 21-year-old with what Breuer described as a highly poetic temperament. Freud never met her, but Breuer's account of her treatment helped convince him that hysteria was connected to the slumbering imagination.
The patient had been a young girl of unusual education and gifts, who had fallen ill while she was nursing her father, to whom she was fondly devoted.
As her father grew weaker, Bertha rarely left her room, except to sit by his bedside. In her distress, she developed increasingly bizarre symptoms: a nervous cough, headaches, blurred vision, paralysis in an arm or leg, hallucinations. Terrified by the thought of her father's death, she conjured up images of fear and mortality. Overwhelmed, she turned to Breuer for help. Breuer put her into a hypnotic trance.
Breuer arrived at a new method of treatment. He made her tell him what it was that was oppressing her mind, and the symptom disappeared.
The thought of her father's death and her passionate love for him had been too much for Bertha to bear. Hypnosis, Breuer discovered, seemed to free her to explore her suffering. Bertha described talking to Breuer as chimney sweeping.
When she talked freely and he encouraged her, the symptoms would disappear. They might come back, and then you did it again, and they would go away. It's something that was unheard of, that you might get rid of certain symptoms by talking them out.
There is a thought that is so unacceptable to her that she has to banish it from consciousness. But even though it's banished, it does its dirty work anyway in producing symptoms. Hysterical symptoms are linked to specific traumatic events that have been not accessible to normal states of consciousness. Therefore, you hypnotize the person, put them in a state where they can gain access to these traumatic memories, and they disappear. That was the rationale for Breuer's treatment.
From the case of Anna O., Freud learned that recapturing the past promised hope for the future. Bertha was the first person to experience what she herself called the talking cure. After further struggle, Bertha's symptoms subsided. One day she would become an ardent feminist and a pioneer social worker. In 1891, on Freud's 35th birthday, his father gave him the family Bible to remind his son of his Jewish heritage. "My dear son," Jacob wrote in Hebrew, "go, read. There will be open to you the sources of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. From your Father, who loves you with unending love." But Jewish rites and rituals had no appeal to Freud. He had not been raised as an observant Jew. He celebrated Christmas every year, complete with candlelit trees and presents for the children.
Freud didn't accept Judaism as a religion. He was an unbelieving Jew. But there's no doubt that he fully identified and had the identity of a Jew.
For centuries, Central European Jews had lived in fear of murder and massacre, oppressed by cruel social and economic injustices. By the time Freud was 11, they had been given the rights of other citizens. But anti-Semitism persisted, and Freud was never unaware of it.
Freud's marginality as a Jew played a role in his developing his ideas, because it's standing back and rather than being absorbed and taking for granted cultural norms and cultural assumptions and beliefs, he's critiquing them, he's questioning them, he's challenging them.
He knew that he was very bright. He knew that about himself. And he was going to prove to the world that a Jew could become a great man.
By the fall of 1891, Freud was earning just enough money to move to a new apartment in the heart of Vienna. For nearly 5 decades, this would be his home. Here in the small office adjoining his apartment, he would receive his patients and do the work that would at last bring him the fame he always believed would be his. As a young researcher, Freud had dissected the brain and studied its anatomy under a microscope. Now he would study the mind and attempt to penetrate its mysteries with the scalpel of his own intellect. At first, like Breuer, Freud hypnotized his patients, encouraging them to tell him their stories while under a hypnotic trance. But hypnosis wasn't helping them.
In a hypnotic trance, People would talk about things that they couldn't talk about, wouldn't talk about under other circumstances, and that could help. But it wasn't lasting. People would have momentary cures under hypnosis and then lapse right back into their illness again.
Gradually, Freud abandoned hypnosis altogether. Instead, he urged his patients to shut their eyes. He applied the pressure of his hands to their foreheads. Anything to get them to tell him what they remembered. Nothing worked. Then he hit upon a technique that became the cornerstone of his treatment. He simply asked his patients to talk. He would listen, encouraging them to let their thoughts drift, to free associate.
That's how free association was born. All he asked for is that the patient pledge himself to say everything.
It may be boring, it may be repetitious, it may make you feel silly and you may be ashamed to believe something or other. It may be very dirty, it may be criminal, doesn't matter.
Freud transformed the passive hypnotic patient to whom people were giving suggestion into a source of information. Charcot actually commanded his patients to get well. Freud inquired. That was a huge revolution. If a patient suffers from hysteria, you want to know why, you ask.
Freud saw himself as a kind of archaeologist, digging deeper and deeper into the buried past, and prided himself on the antiquities he collected throughout his life, displaying them in his consulting room.
I like to compare my procedure with the technique of excavating a buried city, clearing away the pathogenic psychical material layer by layer.
From fragments of the past, he struggled to interpret the present. His statues stood as emblems of the instinctual life itself.
Freud learns that people seem to be guided by forces over which they don't have really complete control. And he begins to develop this idea that maybe this unconscious is worth studying in a more systematic way than it's ever been.
What his patients said mattered. Everything was important, even their dreams. Men and women had always wondered at dreams, imagined them as hidden messages, feared them as mysterious omens, invested them with prophetic powers. Doctors in Freud's day dismissed dreams as irrelevant nonsense. But Freud was curious.
Somebody else could have passed dreams by. This was one of those genius ideas. Everybody dreams, so this was the huge step from a medical specialty to a discovery that matters to everyone.
If you take the simple hypothesis that dreaming is a continuation of thinking in the sleeping state, then looking at your dreams may well be a way of understanding your preoccupations, your concerns, what you're most upset by, what you're most preoccupied by. That may not be that easily accessible when you're talking to me awake.
Every summer, Freud fled the heat of Vienna to vacation with his family in the Alps. He loved hiking the mountain trails with his children, gathering the wildflowers, and identifying the mushrooms dotting the alpine meadows. There was one place he liked best, his son Martin later wrote, a lake high in the Königssee. Freud and his children enjoyed riding the ferry, especially when the steersman fired an ancient pistol, sending reverberations echoing from mountain wall to mountain wall. But even on vacation, he never stopped trying to unravel the mystery of hysteria, which had by now become an obsession.
I was sitting deep in contemplation of the charm of the distant prospect, so lost in thought that at first I did not connect it with myself when these words reached my ears. "Are you a doctor, sir? You wrote your name in the visitor's book in the inn. The truth is, sir, my nerves are bad."
Freud looked up and saw an 18-year-old girl asking for help. When he wrote about her later, he called her Katerina. When she recounted her ailments, shortness of breath, dizziness, a crushing feeling in her chest, a choking in her throat, Freud was convinced that she suffered from hysteria. Her symptoms first appeared, she told Freud, when she discovered her father having sex with her sister. She was frightened, she said, because her father had attempted to force her to have sex with him 2 years before, when she was just 14.
She obviously developed trust in Freud, or she had the need to talk, but she talked relatively easily.
At the end of these memories, she came to a stop. She was like someone transformed. The sulky, unhappy face had grown lively. Her eyes were bright. She was lightened and exalted.
You'd be amazed how helpful it can be to somebody who's undergone any kind of rape experience or molestation experience and never been able to tell the tale, to tell it. But we know now that more needs to be done.
She told him this story, so he thought that now that she confessed it to him, that's it. Freud considered her cured, but this is not an analysis. Freud's idea at that time was that you are hysteric because you repress something. The mere act of making it conscious is the cure, the transformation from one realm, the unconscious, into another realm, the conscious, is curative. That was Freud's original idea. Later on, he learned better.
Freud was still groping. He had helped Katerina, but he only vaguely understood how. Later, he would learn that to help someone takes more than insight, that there was much more to healing than solving a puzzle.
It's the beginning of a whole journey that will take on increasing complexity. At that time, he was operating on a simple idea. You make something conscious.
I hope this girl derives some benefit from our conversation. I have not seen her since. If someone were to assert that the present case history is not so much an analyzed case of hysteria as a case solved by guessing, I should have nothing to say against him.
Freud and Breuer elaborated their ideas in professional journals and finally in a book, Studies in Hysteria. But their collaboration and their friendship was coming to an end over a highly charged issue.
Whatever case and whatever symptom we take as our starting point, in the end, we infallibly come to the realm of sexual experience.
Freud kept noting the sexual material peeping out from behind the symptoms of his patients. In an era when sexuality was a forbidden subject, Freud grew convinced that the cause of hysteria lay not just with any early traumatic experience, but with early traumatic sexual experience.
respectable people in the 19th century were very squeamish about the matter of sexuality. They didn't talk about it. If they talked about it at all, they used euphemisms. They went into marriage uninformed. This was the kind of unacceptable subject. And Freud argues that what's unacceptable will then be repressed. It will be put into that invisible compartment in your mind. And this is something that Freud thought Breuer had failed to see.
The plunging into sexuality in theory and practice, Breuer wrote, is not to my taste. He objected that Freud had collapsed the complex lives of his patients into one sweeping theme: sexuality.
Freud's scientific training was to look for the single cause behind a multiplicity of phenomena, which could produce reductive explanations. The single-minded attention to sexual desire did obscure other desires. But you have to be single-minded when you are going against great forces of opposition and centuries of different understanding, and you are trying to lever your way into something novel. Freud's theory is a very frightening one. It's very frightening to think that people are as moved around by their sexual desire as Freud held them to be.
The collaboration between Freud and Breuer was over. The bond between the two men broken, never to be mended.
The development of psychoanalysis cost me his friendship. It was not easy for me to pay such a price, but I could not escape it.
This is the beginning of a long pattern of getting very close to and even worshiping a man and then having to break from him. Freud wants a strong male figure to worship. He needs the great man to idealize and identify with, and then he goes way beyond them.
By the middle of the 1890s, Freud was increasingly isolated from his colleagues, pursuing his research on his own, certain he was on the way to a discovery that would make him famous.
I am pretty well alone here in tackling the neuroses, regarded rather as a monomaniac, while I have the distinct feeling that I have touched on one of the great secrets of nature.
Settled comfortably in the routines of daily life, he was consumed by his work. But the ardor had disappeared from his marriage.
It was a very ordinary life of a professional and his wife and family. Martha was very tolerant of the idea that he worked late into the night. She took care of the kids, and he did the work, and that was it. Her role was to keep the household going and make that all possible.
We have wonderful courting letters before marriage, but after marriage we only get laundry letters. It's all practical. We don't have a single love letter after marriage.
With no one to talk to about his radical ideas, Freud saved his passionate outpourings for a new friend. Wilhelm Fliess was an ear, nose, and throat specialist from Berlin, a reputable doctor with a large practice. Of all the men Freud looked to for understanding, sympathy, and support, Fliess appears the oddest choice.
Fliess had theories of his own, very strange kind of connection between the nose and sexual feelings. If you were to read Freud and Fliess at that time, you wouldn't know which of them or whether both of them were crazy.
Freud was desperately alone, and what Freud did was to write down and send to Fliess everything that occurred to him. Freud always regarded Fliess as superior to him.
How much I owe you. Solace, understanding, stimulation in my loneliness, meaning to my life. It is primarily through your example that intellectually I gain the strength to trust my judgment. For all that, accept my humble thanks. I know that you do not need me as much as I need you.
If you read some of the letters to Fleece, they sound almost as romantic as his letters to Martha. He clearly was a sounding board for Freud. The need to have a figure to confide in, admire, even idealize, is probably especially poignant and intense when you're charting uncharted territory and think that you have broken through, made important discoveries, but are not quite sure. So you find someone who you respect and admire, and you share some of these ideas with them.
I think only about the neuroses, but I have to rely solely upon myself, which is why progress is slow. I have spent the hours of the night from 11 to 2 with such fantasizing, overworked, irritated, confused, stopped only when I came up against an absurdity. I have a whole series of the most peculiar things I could tell you. Hysteria is a consequence of pre-sexual sexual shock. The need for you increases greatly. I keep collecting material. Your praise is nectar and ambrosia for me. I am overflowing with new ideas. It will still be a long time before you can ask me about results.
Freud was investigating his own memories and dreams now. His moods swinging wildly between elation and despair.
I thought I had the secret already. The origin of neuroses pursues me everywhere. Now I know I don't have it yet. I'm still all mixed up.
He suffered from episodic depressions.
Everything fine except for the 3-day migraine.
He had all kinds of heart arrhythmias.
Shooting pains down the left arm, burning in the heart region, constant tension, pressure.
He was very worried about dying.
I would like so much to hold out until 51.
He had all kinds of expectations of the date for his own death.
But I had one day that made me feel it was unlikely.
He was in a troubled state.
I feel aged, sluggish, not healthy. I shall go on suffering for another 4 to 8 years, and then between 40 and 50, perish very abruptly from a rupture of the heart.
For years, Freud worked alone, sharing his theories with no one but Fleece. Then, 2 weeks before his 40th birthday, he felt confident enough to risk revealing his radical ideas.
Gentlemen, imagine that an explorer arrives in a little-known region where his interest is aroused by an expanse of ruins. He may content himself with inspecting what lies exposed to view, but he may have brought picks, shovels, and spades to uncover what is buried. We try in a similar way to make the symptoms of hysteria bear witness to the history of the origin of the illness.
In a lecture at the Viennese Society for Psychiatry and Neurology, Freud presented his theory of the origin of hysteria to his skeptical colleagues.
I put forward the thesis that at the bottom of every case of hysteria, there are one or more occurrences of premature sexual experience, occurrences which belong to the earliest years of childhood. The infantile traumas must be described without exception as grave sexual injuries, some of them absolutely appalling.
Hysteria, Freud argued, was caused by the sexual assault on an innocent child.
He's on novel territory and very, very difficult territory to think about the seduction of children by adults. It's not like there's a huge literature sitting out there about this. No one talked about this. So to piece his way through it and try to understand what might be fantasy, what might be fact, what might be distorted memory, repressed memory, is very, very complicated issues. Hard to understand even after 100 years of work on it.
I have now come to the end of what I have to say today, prepared to meet with contradiction and disbelief. What is even more important to me than the value you put on my results is the attention you give to the procedure I have employed. A new method which gives wide access to processes of thought which have remained unconscious. I cannot believe that psychiatry will long hold back from making use of this new pathway to knowledge.
Freud's colleagues rejected his theory. One of them called it a scientific fairy tale.
His theory is totally unacceptable. The people who listen to it are indifferent, amused, horrified.
Convinced that he had solved the mystery of hysteria, Freud was profoundly disappointed. He celebrated his 40th birthday, still suffering from migraine headaches, fears of an early death, and spells of depression.
At that time, I had reached the peak of loneliness. No one paid any attention to me, and the only thing that kept me going was a bit of defiance.
That summer, Freud's father, Jacob, fell ill. 4 months later, Jacob died.
On the day of the funeral, I was kept waiting at the barber shop, and therefore arrived at the house of mourning late. The family was displeased with me, somewhat offended by my lateness.
That night, Freud had a dream.
I was in a place where there was a sign. You are requested to close the eyes. I recognized the place as the barber shop I visit every day.
Freud was by now convinced that dreams held a key to unlocking the secrets of the mind. His dream on the night of his father's funeral concealed a clue to his own troubled state.
The dream obviously refers to something that he didn't want to look at. If Freud were my patient and he would present me the dream, I would say to him, is there something about your father that you would rather not look at?
Next time on Young Dr. Freud, tragedy sparks the battle within his own mind.
He knew he was in trouble. He was, in those years, the patient.
And leads him to the path of discovery. Next time on Young Dr. Freud. Visit PBS online to learn more about Freud, read his essays and letters, or take a virtual tour of his legendary office. It's all online at pbs.org. Young Dr. Freud is available on videocassette from PBS Home Video by calling 1-800-PLAY-PBS. This program was made possible in part by a grant from the Dana Foundation and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
We are PBS.
You're watching World. Stay tuned for more great programming on World.
WGBH brings you the world, made possible by a world of supporters. Become one today. Learn more at WGBH.org. Thank you.
We see this as belonging to citizens of the world.
What they're proposing, it's a travesty.
We have got to ensure that it's communication that drives commerce.
This is nature's art.
Nature at its finest.
The miracle of nature.
Ouch.
History tied these two men together.
She was a woman in a man's world. She beat the Moguls at their own game.
People treated him like some rock star.
He sees it as a scientific puzzle.
Cutting-edge science.
It's detective work.
This is the first clear piece of evidence that we have.
The universe, it's got to make sense.
You cannot walk down the street without being bombarded.
It's like a drug. You have to have it.
We are about to experience an indescribable event.
All of a sudden, you look down at the puzzle and you realize you've got it.
Find out more about our vehicle donation program by calling or visiting our website. It's an easy way to support WGBH. Thanks.
You want the truth. We'll help you find it. You want the whole story. We won't stop until it's uncovered. You want to think for yourself. We'll give you what you need to decide. Frontline. In a world full of questions, we answer to no one but you.
Stay tuned for more great programming on World.
Coming up. I think it's Matthew Schneider's going to go. It's another hooking call. Team USA's power play can't get it going here. This is Ralston on the puck. And see how he's forced by Timonen, who's a terrific player. And now Koivu just looks and says, you know what, I'm going to go to the net. And in doing so, draws a penalty. And actually, it's Tkachuk on the far side, not Schneider. My apologies. But Peter Laviolette looking down the bench, trying to find combinations. We'll have 4-on-4 action here for a minute 11.
Jokinen and Peltonen will be out there working, and they